Hello everyone and welcome. Today I've got something fun in mind, which has been shown in one of the recent movies, Deadpool and Wolverine, where Cassandra is wiggling her hand through people's minds and heads in a creepy fashion. Quick interruption, about 87% of you aren't subscribed yet, but do watch my videos. So if you like them, please consider subscribing, leaving a like, commenting. It will help me out a lot. Thank you. Now I think the original effect was made in Houdini, probably with skin stretching simulations and whatnot, but we're actually going to make it in Blender, at least something that looks a bit similar, at least in a fun way. I'm going to create a new file and we're gonna start this all from scratch, and perhaps we can choose a more real-time kind of object like Suzanne. So let's delete the cube, Shift A, mesh, and let's go with monkey Suzanne. And right away, let's just add a subdivision level. That's a modifier, a subdivision of like 3. No, let's add 4. Yeah, let's do that for now and shade it smooth. And open up a new window to Geometry Nodes Editor. And let me also enable my screencast keys. I'm going to set this to beautiful pink. There we go. And now that is probably overlapping with my head. So let me move that to the side like that, perhaps. There we go. And we're just going to be creating the setup. So create new and Shift A, and right away there's only a few things we need. So first off, we need an object to interact this with, right? So we can actually just add a hand model. I downloaded one for free, and I'll actually link that below as well. You can get it for free as well. I'm going to import that, and I believe it was an FBX, so I'm gonna import that as an FBX. There we go. It is a bit big, so let's just scale that down so it matches our object, at least somewhat, you know, something like that. And move it down, and let's set the origin to the object as well, to geometry. And let's scale this so we have a nice interaction. So something like this, and let's go into edit mode, and we may just have to clean this up a little bit. It's a bit high poly. I'm gonna shade this auto smooth, and let's also add a decimate modifier. And let's try unsubdivide first, see if it works. It works, which is perfect. So we can do unsubdivide level of perhaps 2. Let's see. Yeah, something like that. This works fine for now. We can always, when we have the setup ready, switch out our objects to whatever we want. And I'm going to apply this as well. Hover over it and press Ctrl A. And now in edit mode, it's just a bit more manageable. So let's actually just position this in the head somewhere in Suzanne so we can see what is going on. And let's just make this a fun kind of rotation and everything, so we can actually get this nicely sticking out of the head a little bit. Something like that, perhaps. All right, scale it up a little bit, like so. Now let's open up the geometry node window, add modifier to our Suzanne. We already have that. So now we can start creating things. So make sure to save your file and name it Wiggler or whatever, Mind Wiggler, Mind Noodler, and let's just drag our hand into the setup. There we go. And that's it. Right, so we can now just, if we connect the head, or sorry, the hand, we can see how it looks. And perhaps we should set this to relative instead. There we go. And now we've got the correct setup, right? So that is beautiful. And now we want some interaction with the hand, okay? Now the most prominent kind of setup we need is a proximity with the hand and the head, okay? So what we can do is drag this out to a geometry proximity. And then we can actually grab the distance and the position and do stuff with it. But before we do that, I want to visualize what that looks like. So I'm going to Ctrl-Shift left click on my inputs and also Ctrl-Shift click on the proximity. And then we see the position, but if we do it again, Ctrl-Shift click, we see the distance between the hand and the head, right? The proximity mask. And that is something that we want to be using to specify what parts of the mesh are going to be moving. And we're gonna just create a very simple initial setup with that, so you can all follow along quite easily. So let's say this is the mask, and we wanna use this to drive a set position node, for example. So let's find Shift A as a set position node. There we go. And we can now just drag that a bit to the right. And now we can use this distance mask to define the offset of the position. Now, I want the position to change related to the hand pretty much, but in a matter that the surface first, let me just go to the side, moves away like this. It goes closer to the finger and out of the mesh, and then it goes in to create like a little bit of a surface tension kind of way. And this means that we need to move it away from the surface in a normal direction, but we also need to snap it to that finger, right? So there's two kind of motions we need to do and iterate through that in order to keep it sticking to that finger instead of going wild. So we are going to set that up first, and we've got that mask for it. We just set that up. And that means that the first thing I'm going to do is move the mesh out a bit, right? So that it's going to create that nice bump. So we're going to press Shift A and find a normal. And I just want to have a bit of an offset in the normal direction of that mesh. So if I now just hide this viewer, we can see what that looks like. I'm just going to delete it, Ctrl X, right? And we've got a normal, and now every point is moved in the normal direction of the surface, which is, well, a bit much. So let's just find a vector math, set to scale, and now we can actually control how much that moves out. So now everything is moving out, but we only want the mask here to control that. So let's just set the scale to 0.03 for now, or 0.0, yeah, that's fine. And then we're just gonna move this a bit to the left and find Shift A, a mixed vector. There we go. And I want the vector to be mixed between 0, an offset of 0 means just the original position, and an offset of this, right? I'm going to set this to B and see what happens if we connect the distance here to the vector. There we go. Nothing really seems to happen. And the reason is because we don't really have enough control in that mask. So let's just crank up our value. Let's set this to 0.3 for now. You can see that something is happening, but it's not really the right way, okay? And that is because the mask, let me visualize the mask and the mesh, it is not really how we want this mask to be. So first things first, we need to just set this mask to resemble what we really want, which means that, for example, we want it to stop here around the finger, and we want a gradient going from like black or white to the maximum value here, and then to the other direction, right? So a fall off here and a fall off there. And that is something we can do, but we need to set that up, right? So now we've got the distance here, and first things first, I'm going to find Shift A, and let's find a map range. I don't want this to have a distance of 1 to 0 or 0 to 1. I want to have a distance that goes to a higher value so that our gradient is cranked inwards a bit, if that makes sense. If I set this to 20, for example, you can see that the gradient is being cranked in because that value is being changed. It's being mapped to new values. So the higher I set this value, the tighter pretty much that gradient is going to be. And that is something we can use later on as well to control how far we want the skin to be indenting or bumping out, right? So that is a nice start. So that is still not exactly what I want, because I want the peak to be here, and then I want, let's say in this case, the white is the follow value, and then I want this to be black and then this to be white again in order to create that little kind of tension, right, of the skin. So Shift A, find a float curve. There we go. And now we can actually control these values. So let's say I crank everything through. Everything is going to be black. Now I want a white peak somewhere. Let's say there, like that. And then I want a nice smoother fall off like that. And I want this here to be black as well, right? So now we can really control the kind of fall off of our kind of bump be next to that hand, right? The mask, basically. So let's just automatically, or not automatically, manually rename this, this, and this, all of this, and Control J is going to be our mask setup, okay? And this is going to be something we're going to be changing probably until the end of the video, just so that every value is right. And now this can be driving this vector that is going to be mixing between an offset of 0 and an offset of whatever I want this to be, right? So I plug this in and delete my viewer node. You can see we're getting some crazy values, mainly because this value of our normal is very high. So let's set this to 0.05 and see what's happening. So you can already tell that the mesh next to the hand is being moved outwards a little bit, right? And that's already an interesting view. Now I can move this hand and it's going to be moving with it as well. But it's not quite what I want. It is the first step. Now this value is a bit much in my opinion for now, so I'm going to set this to 0.25. So just move out a little bit. But now I also want those values to be closer to the actual finger, right? So it's actually going to look like, even if we move this out further next, like let's say we want to move this all the way to there, we need that to stick to the finger somehow, like that, instead of this just following the normal direction like that, right? So we need to set up a kind of iterative system, and we do that by following our set position node in the normal direction with a set position node that's going to snap our value to the position of the proximity of the hand. So we want to drag out this position into another mix vector, mix, I guess, there we go. And I want that to be my position here, right? So this is not going to be the offset, but this is going to be the position, because the position is also what we're getting from the proximity node, right? It's not an offset, it's a position. So if I now drag this all the way to the left, you can see that it's going to try to stick all the points of our mesh to the hand, okay? So we don't exactly want that. We want this to be a mix between that set position, or sorry, the proximity of the hand and the original position. So drag that out to a position, the original position, and now if I set this to 1, it's just going to look like what it did before the set position. And if we set this to 0, it is going to be the snapping to the hand. Now I want this snapping to only happen for this mask. So I can actually just crank this mask into the factor there, and we can swap these values around. This to B and this to A. And you can now see that we're moving the values out, and then we're gonna move them back to the finger. And that is working quite well, but I wanna kind of do this a bit better, one more level. And that means that I want to create an iterative kind of pattern, which means that we're gonna extrude our mesh in the normals, snap to the hand, extrude again to the normals, snap to the hand again, extrude again, snap again, as many times as we want. And that means that we need a repeat zone, right? That is the easiest way to kind of create a repetition. So Shift A, repeat zone, and I want to crank my input into the repeat zone. There we go. And the output to the output. And this is going to happen in the repeat zone, which means we just need to connect this up like that. Beautiful. And now we can actually set a repetition amount that we like, which means if I set this to 5, it's going to do the moving outward 5 times, but also the moving to the hand 5 times. So it's going to move it out first and then move it back to the hand and then repeat that process, right? So this looks a little bit weird, and that is because we are, well, using quite harsh values, I would say. So if we would want to make this a bit more smooth, there's something we can do. And if you want to smoothen something in GeoNodes, you can either use a blur node or you can actually try to smoothen out the mesh itself. So let's try a blur first. So I'm going to hold shift and right mouse and connect these two dots. And what I'm going to do is right after this mask is quite harsh. If we look at it, so if I Ctrl Shift click on my original mesh and then Ctrl Shift click on that mask output, it's gonna show like quite a harsh kind of edge. So we're gonna fix that first by adding a blur node. Okay, so let's just add a blur node. Shift A, blur. There we go. And we can actually set this to, let's say, 5. And you can see it's gonna turn out to be a smoother kind of shape, right? And that may mean that we have to crank these values a bit more custom, so we get more of that black value back right near to that finger, something like that. And now let's just see what it looks like right away. Okay, of course we need to connect this in there, and let's delete our viewer node. I usually use Ctrl X because my hands are just over those keys pretty much all the time instead of delete. There we go. This already looks a lot better, right? It looks like less garbage, I would say. So now we can already start controlling how far we want, for example, this mesh to move outwards, right? You can see it here, you can see it there. This will fix. But here, for example, if I set this to be 0.035, you can see that every iteration of the set position is going to move it out a bit more and then move it back to the finger, right? And we can set this to 0.015 as well. And then we can crank up, for example, the iterations, and we can really start to get a feel of what each value does. So if I set this to 15 instead of 5, it's going to move it out more and more and to repeat the pattern more and more as well, which means extruding and snapping back to the surface. And you can see that different stuff is happening and it's not looking very smooth yet, but we're gonna fix that, don't worry. And you can see that we now get more of like that bumpiness here, the more iterations we really use. So we're gonna be playing around with that later as well. But for now, I'm gonna set this to 5 because the more repetitions we have here, the slower it is going to be. Okay, so let's set this back to 0.025 as well. Something like that. And now we're gonna do another step of magic. So let's drag this out to the right, and we're gonna add another way of smoothing, which is gonna get rid of this kind of weirdness there. And what I wanna do is for each repetition, I wanna smoothen my mesh before it does the next repetition. So Shift A and find an edge vertices. And now we've got a position of a vertex and of the vertex closest to it. And we can actually add those vectors with an add node and give it a sec. I'm gonna disconnect this for a sec because it's making everything slow, and position 2 as well. And then we can find a vector math set to scale and 0.5. And what this does, it is going to add the vectors of position 1 and position 2. It's gonna add them together, and it's gonna find, with scaling by a half, it's gonna find the middle ground pretty much, if that makes sense. And that's basically going to smoothen out our mesh. So we can now just find another set position node, duplicate that, and what we want to do is, well, set a new position based on this kind of average position. So we can just drag and drop this into the position node there. And that is going to mean that every repetition, we're also going to get a new kind of smoothing iteration. Now, this is going to smoothen out the entire mesh though. That is not completely what we want. And that means that we have to basically mix vector, that average position, with the old position. So drag that out to a position node. And we want the vector to be, well, pretty much that mask as well. Right, so we can just drag and drop that into the vector. There we go. And I think we need, well, let's see what this looks like first, right? Give it a sec to load up. And there we go. You can already tell it is working way smoother than it did before, right? So let's mute this set position node with M, and you can see the difference before and after. I'm gonna mute this. Right, we got very hard and weird looking faces and edges and overlapping stuff. But if we unmute this, we're actually going to get a much smoother kind of mesh pretty much ever. It may still be a little bit silly here and there, but it's looking much better in general. And if we add more iterations to our repeat zone, let's say 8, we're also repeating that smoothing of the mesh more and more. All right, so if you want more smoothing even, what we can do is let's set this back to 5. We can add a bit more value to that mask, which means that if I now add Shift A mask node, for example, right there, and let's set this to multiply, and give it a sec to load, we can now set a high value like 10, for example, and really add some value to that smoothing. And perhaps we need to switch these values. Let's do that. So we've got the right order. That may help. There we go. And there we go. We smoothen everything better, right? And let's blur that a bit more as well. So we actually have a bit more blurring going on pretty much everywhere. There we go. Add another blur node. And let's just see what that does. There we go, right? So this already looks a lot better. We're actually creating a nice effect of that skin going out and back in. And if you want this to be closer to your finger, all you need to do basically is bring that peak more to the left side, right? So I can just drag this to the left, let it load for a second and see the changes right there. You can tell. And if you want it to be closer, just drag that peak a bit more to the left too. All right. Something like that. And then it's going to be closer to that actual finger. And then we can control, like I said before, how far this pretty snapping is going to take place by controlling the 2 max value. So the higher I make this, the less, the closer it's going to snap to the surface. So if I set this to 15, for example, just have a look at how far it's going to be going to that finger, right? And if I set this to higher values, 35, for example, it's going to be closer, right? The higher the value, the closer to the finger. And you can see that works perfectly, right? So let's, well, work with that. It's actually looking quite cool. I'm going to set this back to 25. I think I like that value. There we go. And you can now just set up some control values if you want, but this is a very easy setup, as you can tell. And let's just group some stuff up. I have this. This is going to be Control G. This is just going to be my smoothing group, right? So we don't really need to do anything with that. Just group it. Let me disconnect this. I'm going to name this to mesh smoothing. There we go. Mesh smoothing value. This is my repeat zone, obviously, my kind of main setup that we need. Then we have this and this. The first set position is the this is the extrusion, so Ctrl G that, exit group, this is the extrusion, and the second one, Ctrl G, this is my snapping. All right, so we've got an extrusion and a snapping and one blur value pretty much, and we can actually move that there as well. Beautiful. Or let's just move it here actually, because we use that for 2 things at the same time. Beautiful. And then this initial setup is my mask setup. We can group that as well to our mask setup, right? And that makes everything just a tiny bit easier to read. Now I want some values to be exposed, of course, the iteration count, but also the extrusion value. So this, we can just drag it in there, perhaps even name it, where is it? Extrusion, there we go. And then if we connect this back up, we are basically golden with a setup that works nicely, right? For pretty much every kind of object. Now, before I end this tutorial, we can just try and use this on a different object as well, right? The one you saw in the thumbnail. And before I'm going to do that though, I'm going to make one more change. And that is when I append this geometry node setup, I want this to be named, shall we just name it Mind Noodler? Yeah, there we go, Mind Noodler. And I'm going to go into my mask setup here, and I want this object to be an input there, right? We're gonna set it up so we can reuse it easily. There we go. And let's see anything else. This is going to be our range, our interaction range. We can name that interaction range as well here. Right there, interaction range, beautiful. And then we can go out of this group and see, I'm gonna disconnect my output for a sec so we can make everything work in real time very quickly. The repetition zone I want as an input as well. So now that we've got everything exposed, we can connect this to the group input right there, iterations, the object as well. We can just drag that to the left into a group input, Control H to expose the other variables as well. So object, interaction, I want this to be my initial blur. Right, and rename that to initial blur iterations. There we go. And then I want this iterations to be my repetitions. So this iteration is the repetitions. There we go. And then we've got this to be the extrusion, of course. And the rest we shouldn't really have to touch. All right. I think we do have to change this at some point. But we don't have to expose that. We can't expose that really. And let's see if there's anything in here except for the extrusion. No, in the snapping, not as well. So we're pretty much good to go for the mesh smoothing. We should be fine too. And we've got a iteration here as well. So let's actually expose this too and name that, where is it? This one, drag it in here as well. And let's name this mesh smoothing blur. There we go. Now I'm gonna always set my object at the start and then my interaction range, because that's an important one, and then the repeat zone repetitions, a bit easier to understand. And then we've got our initial blur, extrusion, and extrusion goes in here actually, and you can follow me along here, but it's just the order that I find easy. Right, so this works fine. So then I'm gonna go to my object and I'm gonna deselect my default object, so it's not gonna spawn in when we append this anywhere else. And then right here we need to disconnect this too, in order to also deselect the default object here. Otherwise it's gonna still spawn, which is annoying. And then in our mask setup, we also have to disconnect that here and deselect the default there. Right, that's just something that you need to remember in geometry nodes. When you've got an object in your object info and you connect the inputs, it will always store that as a default object unless you really just unselect that, right? So the same thing here, select object, you need to unselect the default object, otherwise it's going to spawn in every time you append this object. A bit annoying, but it's fine. So this works great. So object is interaction object. And I'm gonna save this, Control S, and I'm gonna open up my my other file, this one, and we're just gonna go to File, Append. I'm gonna locate my Wiggler blend file, the one we just created, and go to the once you're in there, just go to the node tree, and then append the, what do we call it, Mind Noodler geometry node setup. Right, it's that easy. And then we can go to Add Modifier, Geometry Nodes, and select the Mind Noodler. Okay, nothing's working. Very easy, is because we have not got any object selected here. Now, before I'm gonna do that, well, we can actually just do that because we also haven't really connected the output yet, which is fine because I want to change parameters first anyway. So I'm gonna set this to be my hand, right? So the hand that's already in the scene. And if we now connect that, it's gonna work. But I already played around with settings a little bit, so I'm just going to change those settings, right? And we can do that right here in the modifier tab. So interaction rate, I'm going to set this to 23. And then I'm going to set my initial blur iterations just to 1. And my mesh smoothing blur is going to be 3. And my repeat zone iteration is going to be 10. And extrusion is going to be, let me check real quick. The extrusion will be 0.22. All right. And let's see if this works. So we've got a weird looking hand, you can see, but it looks nice if we've got the head as an overlay. I mean, this hand, it won't really work, you know, but it's fine. I like how it looked in my repeat zone here. Let's connect that up and see how it looks. Hopefully it works. Should work on any setup. And there we go. This is exactly the result that I'm looking for. We got some nice geometry bumping up there. And going back down, and it even looks like some skin is stretching or looking a bit weird, right? So let's just go into camera view and see how this looks, and I think we got a pretty cool effect here. Let's see. There we go. Isn't that cool? We got some hands poking out of this head, and you can just change this into every shape and the stuff just works, right? That's the fun thing about the procedural setup. So let me just, you know, go into the GeoNode setup and show you that that works, right? So let's click on the head. I'm going to disconnect this, and let's just pose the hands slightly different, okay? Just slightly different. We can just connect this, by the way, and just unhide, I suppose, this GeoNode setup. And for the head now, we can just select the armature. I'm going to go to pose modes, and let's just pose this hand so it looks different in the head. We can just rotate this like that, get it into the other eyeball, for example, like this. I just want this to look kind of crazy. And we can pose the hand. I just added a very easy rig to this, and you can do the same thing to the head. And the hand that I linked below, it is the same hand, but I just rigged it very easily. There we go, something like that. This goes out more. We can just have some fun with that. I want this to stretch a bit. Oh, that's too much. Something like that. Is that an interesting pose? I don't know. I'm not sure. Let's actually move all of this. I don't really care about the anatomy of the hand at this point, as you can tell probably. I just want this to stick out cool. Something like that. Let's just test it. I'm not going to go crazy on details here. And if we now re-enable that setup by just unhiding it, we can see that it's going to work. And 3, 2, 1. There we go. We've got the finger sticking back up. Again, right? This one is really cool out of the eyeball. And this one as well. And this one too. This one too. Wow, I really like the setup actually. It's going cool. This one as well actually. Let's just see how this looks in rendered view. With some extra shading and stuff. As you can see, it actually looks really interesting. So that is pretty much it. It's very usable, very efficient, very easy setup actually. I would have thought it would be harder, but here we are. If you like this video, please leave a like, a comment, subscribe. I will enjoy any one of those, and then I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.